and a fine good morning to everyone here. If you'll take a look at the sheet that I handed out, there's a big graph on the front of the sheet. And what this is, it's a graph of all the recessions we have had for 100 years between 1910 and 2010. And the interesting thing about that is the sheet shows that we've had recessions between 1 and 10 years. About the longest we've ever gone without a recession is about 10 years. And if you read up on the 2008 recession, it ended in the middle of 2009, which most people I know don't believe that. And at the middle of 2009, the recession ended, and then we started a period of what was called recovery. Again, all of the small business owners I know, when I've asked them about how their recovery is going, they all laugh and say, "What recovery?" even today in 2018. One of the odd things about the 2008 recession is it's like the Federal Reserve ran out of options to restart the economy. And if you look at the fact that, okay, the last recession ended in 2009, and historically we've got about 10 years, that means we're looking at 2019 or 2020 for the next recession. And if you're following the news, you're seeing reports that are predicting the next recession in the next year or two. It's amazing how that boom and bust cycle repeats. But if you look at the quote here near the bottom of the page by Ben Castleman, who is an economics and business writer now for the New York Times, he wrote an article in 2014, I believe it was, where he said the Federal Reserve took all sorts of unprecedented steps to save and later jumpstart the U.S. economy. It bailed out banks, it bailed out foreign banks, it bailed out non-banks, it cut interest rates pretty much to zero, it bought government bonds, it bought mortgage bonds, it started, and this one was truly radical, holding press conferences. Again, if you've ever been following the Federal Reserve, one thing they never do is speak in public. And now they're holding press conferences. So I wanted to share with you that there is a pattern to the boom and bust cycle for recessions. There's a pattern. And if you'll flip the page on the back side of the sheet, here are the steps that we see that make up that boom and bust cycle that repeats itself every 1 to 10 years, basically, in our economy. First is that after a recession, the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates, and this means you can borrow money more cheaper. The interest rate at 3% is a lot cheaper than the interest rate at 5%. So when money gets cheap, businesses are more likely to borrow that money to improve or to create new businesses. People are more likely to borrow cheap money to buy a new house or new car, to make improvements on things they think is worthwhile. Now with more money, item 2, with more money being borrowed into existence, there is more money to produce and buy goods and services. Well, if I can buy more goods and services, then that creates a boom in the economy. And as we buy more things because we have more money available, we have to produce more things to sell. And when we produce more things, this creates jobs and expands the economy. People get better jobs, they buy bigger homes, they take on more debt, and times are good. Well, item 3 here indicates that the more we borrow, the more debt we create. And that debt cannot be fully paid back. Because when we borrow money into existence, we borrow the principal into existence, but not the interest. Now think about that. As you pay back the principal, you cancel out the money. And you can reach a point where you cancel out all the money, but you still owe the interest. And what that does, based upon the design of the system, it forces a certain part of the population into default. And to me, that's just wrong. But again, let me persist here. As the economy grows, the banking system raises interest rates, and we're seeing that happen now. And this makes money more expensive and harder to borrow. And as all that principal gets paid back, it starts reducing the amount of money in circulation and guarantees that as money becomes more scarce, more people will have to default on their loans. And as the debt gets bigger and the available money gets smaller, eventually there's not enough money to cover all the debts, and the economy goes bust. Businesses go out of business, people lose their jobs, lose their homes, lose their businesses, and the economy is forced to shrink or recede, and this is what we call a recession. And once the recession hits, the banks reduce interest rates and try to kickstart the economy, and the boom and bust cycle starts all over again. Again, if you look back on that 100-year history, you see that pattern repeated. Now, the question we want to look at is, where are we now in that boom and bust cycle? Now, if you look at the other graph here, a fellow named Ray Dalio, who is a billionaire investor and a hedge fund manager, he says that we have two types of debt cycle. We have a short-term debt cycle, which we can all observe in the past 20 or so years repeating itself, as it repeats itself about every 10 years. Ray Dalio says 5 to 8, but we can differ there. And he says that there's also a long-term, once-in-a-lifetime debt cycle that runs 75 to 100 years. Now, if you look at the graph, you'll see that that big, long, up and then down and then up is the 75 to 100-year debt cycle. But then the squiggles that go all along that is a short-term cycle. And there's an article that I read that indicates that we have probably one more short cycle before we hit the big drop. And when that happens, I'm not sure how we're going to come out of it. So again, this could be a big deal. We are heading up on the next recession. We've got the big one that's coming, if you trust Ray Dalio's prediction. And the question is, how do we fix that? Well, the challenge that I'm seeing is that it's up to Congress to save us, and they're not really doing anything right now. And my solution is that we need to make monetary reform a primary issue in every election and keep electing somebody new until Congress takes us seriously to figure out how to save us from this repeating cycle of boom and bust that eventually is going to wreck the economy every 5 to 10 years. President Lincoln figured out how to do that. He created a debt-free money system in 1862 by creating money free of charge in the Treasury, and he used that money to pay for and win the Civil War. Now, if President Lincoln can do that, why can't we? Again, looking at that boom and bust cycle, we have to figure out how to redesign the money system so that the money system itself does not cause the problem.